Take your Bible, whether it's paper or digital, and turn with me to Daniel chapter 9. Daniel chapter 9, one of the most beautiful prayers of confession in the Bible, and one of the most debated passages of prophecy in the Bible. So we've got our work cut out for us. I'm probably going to go a little bit long this morning, just telling you that ahead of time. We're in Daniel chapter 9, and we'll get there in a few minutes. By the way, if this is your first time with us, we are so glad you've chosen to worship with us today. One of the things that we want you to know about us is that most Sunday mornings we are teaching our way through whole books of the Bible. And this summer we are in a series through the book of Daniel, a book that helps us know how to live faithfully as the people of God when we are in the minority, in a culture that doesn't share our beliefs and values. And we learn not just how to survive, but actually how to thrive as a minority. You may have noticed, but a seismic shift has occurred in our country in the past 20 years or so, when we're now living in what many people refer to as a post-Christian culture, a culture where the beliefs and values that shape our lives are not embraced by the majority of the people that we live with and rub shoulders with each day. And Christians that live in places like Portland and New York and Seattle and San Francisco, they've accepted the fact that they are viewed as strange and stupid and irrelevant. But people like us living here in the South, we're still having a hard time making the adjustments to all these changes. And it's easy to view ourselves as victims and martyrs. It's easy to have hearts filled with anger and resentment and bitterness towards the people that don't believe the way we do, and towards people who we think have stolen our country from us. And it's hard to thrive in a culture that stirs up feelings like that, isn't it? Well, the book of Daniel helps us know how to thrive in Babylon by telling us the story of four Hebrew young men: Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. The chief main character is Daniel, of course. And these guys were taken from their home in Jerusalem, taken into captivity and exile to a faraway land of Babylon. And they're struggling to figure out how to be faithful to their God and to their identity as the people of God in exile. So every week, we've been exploring how this book speaks to God's people anytime, any place where they find themselves in a minority, where they're trying to be faithful and hopeful in the midst of a culture that kind of just thinks you're stupid, thinks that what you believe is stupid, and your way of life is stupid. And it's difficult. It is hard to live like that, to live in the tension of being in Babylon, but not of Babylon. But Daniel and his three friends help us to do that, because one of the things that we see is what they didn't do. They didn't run away and hide in some monastery or some community out in the desert and wall up by themselves. And they didn't take a stand over every single thing in Babylon that was contrary to the law of their God or that rubbed them the wrong way. I know these guys, they served in the government of Babylon. They learned the language. They dressed like Babylonians. They got PhDs from Babylonian universities, and they participated in Babylonian culture. But there were times, these moments, these draw a line in the sand kind of moment, where they said, no, I can't go along with that. That would be compromise for me. I can't do that. And it was like things like food and worshiping the empire and praying to the king as God. And to those things they said no. And for them it was risky and it was difficult and life-threatening for them. Now, one of the things that we haven't talked about in the book so far is why and how Daniel and his friends got there in the first place. How did they end up in exile in the first place? And so the answer to that question, you got to know something about the storyline of the Old Testament, because the book of Daniel doesn't tell you why they ended up in exile. It assumes that you know the story. So here's a thumbnail sketch of Israel's history. God redeems Israel from slavery, from captivity in Egypt. That's the story in Exodus. You remember Pharaoh, Moses, 10 plagues, crossing the Red Sea. And God brings them out of captivity in Egypt, rescues them, and brings them to the foot of a mountain. What mountain was that? Mount Sinai. And there, God enters into a binding covenant with Israel, that they will live by the terms of the covenant to become God's unique people, a nation of priests to the rest of the world, the rest of the nations, and they are to show the nations, they're to be a light to the nations, to show them the character of the God of Israel. And what are the first 10 terms of the covenant called? 10 commandments, that's right. And there's 10, those are the first 10, and then there's about 600 more. And God promises them, he says, I will bless obedience, but if you disobey, I will discipline you. So blessing for obedience, discipline for disobedience. And so Israel agrees to the terms of the covenant, and God takes them into the promised land, and what do? They fail miserably. They don't keep the terms of the covenant. They lose their unique identity as the people of God, and they assimilate into the beliefs and culture and values of the surrounding cultures. And for the most part, the better part of 500 years, Israel turns its back on God, rebels against God, and breaks covenant with God. And God puts up with that all this time, through the centuries. He sends prophets to call the people back to God, but they don't listen. So eventually, God sends his people into exile because of their stubborn unfaithfulness to their covenant vows. And that is why Daniel is in exile in Babylon. King Nebuchadnezzar, Babylon comes to Jerusalem. He destroys the city, destroys the temple, and he takes the best stuff and the best people back to Babylon. I want you to think about that. I mean, think about how many people throughout history are living happily, with their family and friends in a land that they love, and then an invading army or a corrupt government comes to power and it destroys everything that they ever cared about, and they end up in a foreign land, in a refugee camp, in a different culture, with a different language, and that's a lot like Daniel's story. But Daniel was a part of the royal family, so he gets a job in the big smack middle of the Babylonian government. I mean, what a horrible situation. He has no hope that things will ever change. Now, Daniel, is he a good guy or a bad guy? Good guy, really good guy. I mean, no sin is recorded against him, which doesn't mean he's sinless, of course. It just means that no sin was recorded against him. So he's a really good guy. Now, by the way, do you know how rare that is in the Bible? I mean, how we end up with children's books full of Bible heroes and models of behavior we should be like, I don't understand. The way we do that is we whitewash, so much of what went on in their lives that shows how bad they really are. And most of the characters in the Bible are terribly inconsistent and morally compromised people. And you only get children's books by taking all of that out. But not Daniel. I mean, you can write a really good children's book about Daniel because he's a really good guy. So stop and put yourself in Daniel's sandals just for a minute. I mean, you've been as faithful as you possibly can be to the God of Israel, and you're sitting in Babylon through no fault of your own, but because of all the failures and the unfaithfulness of your fathers and your forefathers and the corrupt kings and corrupt priests who worship false gods of other nations, that's why you're stuck in Babylon. You've been faithful. It's their fault. But you're suffering for their sin. So how do you feel about that? I mean, how do you feel about that after 1 decade? How about 2 decades? 3? And every day is a battle trying to be faithful to God in a foreign land. Now, if you can put yourself emotionally into Daniel's shoes, try to imagine how easy it would be to start feeling bitter. I mean, if you were Daniel, how easy would it be to live with this undercurrent of anger and bitterness and resentment and frustration because you're reaping the consequences of somebody else's sin? How easy would that be? I think that would be very easy. I mean, it would be very easy for him to adopt a kind of a self-righteous martyr mentality, a victim identity, like here I am, and I'm stuck here in a place I don't want to be because of someone else's stupid decisions. I mean, it's pretty easy to live a pity party kind of life, wouldn't you think? I mean, here's the thing. Like when God's people are a faithful minority, there's a mindset that can take hold of you if you're not careful. When you see yourself as part of God's faithful few, you can begin to see yourself as morally superior. And you look out at the majority culture and you're like, those people are the reason that my life is so hard. They're the reason that our country is going to hell in a handbasket, and I hope they burn in hell, right? I mean, when we see ourselves as God's faithful few, the temptation is to see ourselves as morally superior to everybody else, to be self-righteous and mean-spirited towards the people who you think have sent you into exile. So, just think. Can you think of any other times and places in history where there are religious people who identify themselves as God's faithful few, and they look out at the dominant culture, and they think that they are the voice of truth, and they speak for God alone? Maybe like today, I don't know. And what's the dominant attitude of people who see themselves as God's faithful few who speak for God alone? Well, I mean, the tone is anger and resentment and bitterness and disdain and disgust and grumbling and complaining and condemnation. Yeah, so, I mean, we wouldn't blame Daniel if he became angry and accusatory, blaming everybody else. I mean, we wouldn't blame him if he created distance, like, here I am, and I'm trying to do right, and there they are, and they're messing everything up. And he can very easily end up with this us and them kind of mentality. But what we're going to see as we read through Daniel's prayer here is that that's not the mindset that dominates Daniel's thought life. It's exactly the opposite. And Daniel's prayer shows us the heart of what it means to try and be faithful to God in exile, to thrive in Babylon without distancing ourselves from a culture that makes life hard for us. You follow me? Are you with me? Okay, everybody do this. All right, just wake yourself up, okay? We got a long way to go, all right? This is going to be thick. I'm just telling you up front. Daniel 9, verse 1. In the first year of Darius, the son of Ahasuerus, by descent, a Mede, who was made king over the realm of the Chaldeans, in the first year of his reign, I, Daniel, understood from the scriptures the number of years that according to the word of the Lord given to Jeremiah the prophet, how many years must pass before the end of the desolations of Jerusalem? And it was 70 years. Then I turned my face to the Lord God, seeking him by prayer and pleas for mercy with fasting and sackcloth and ashes. Now, the date given to us in verse 1, it helps us with a couple of things. First of all, it's now been 12 years since Daniel's last recorded vision in chapter 8, which we're not covering that chapter, but I'm going to give you a little bit about it right now. A vision that chapter 8, deals with two of the great beastly empires from Daniel's vision in chapter 7. So let's review. Jim did an excellent job last week unpacking Daniel's vision in chapter 7, the vision of 4 major world empires, reminiscent of Nebuchadnezzar's dream in chapter 2. 4 major world empires that would rise and fall, the first being the Babylonian Empire, symbolized by a winged lion, followed by the Medo-Persian Empire, symbolized by a bear with 3 ribs in its mouth. But in Daniel's dream in chapter 8, the Medo-Persian Empire is pictured as a ram. And here in chapter 9, Daniel is, right now, he is in the Medo-Persian Empire, okay? So, but it's going to eventually fall to Alexander the Great, the Greek Empire, symbolized by a 4-headed winged leopard. And eventually Alexander the Great dies, and his kingdom is split between 4 generals. That's why the leopard had 4 heads. Cassander in Macedonia, Lysimachus in Asia Minor, Seleucus in Syria, and Ptolemy in Egypt. But in chapter 8, which we're not covering, Greece is symbolized as a goat with a horn that defeats the ram, the Medes and Persians. And then that one horn is broken off. Alexander the Great dies. And 4 horns grow up, of which one little horn grows to be the dominant one and brings devastation on the land of Israel for 2,300 days. Daniel 8, chapter 8, verses 13 to 14. The little horn being, history tells us, is Antiochus Epiphanes, who sets the pattern for all the anti-God beasts of all the world empires to follow as pictured in Daniel 7, culminating in the Antichrist, all right? Now, is all that clear? Does that make your head swim? Absolutely. It makes my head swim. I probably read 600 pages trying to sort this out this week. And so my head is swimming. Now, here's why I did that, because I don't expect you to remember any of that. At the end of chapter 8, here's what Daniel tells us in chapter 8, verse 27. I, Daniel, was overcome. When he saw this vision, he was overcome. And he lay sick in the bed for some days. Then I arose and went about the king's business, but I was appalled by the vision, and I didn't understand it. Now, he didn't understand it even though the angel Gabriel came and explained to him the two empires, the Medes and Persians and the Greeks. He tells him it's those empires. But Daniel still doesn't understand it. Now, the important thing to understand from chapters 2, 7, 8, and 9, and we'll see this again through 10 through 12, is that Daniel is given a vision that runs from his own time up through the coming of the Messiah and beyond. That's the point. He's given a vision that runs through his day, up through the coming of Messiah, and beyond that to the end of history. So chapter 9 comes 12 years after the vision in chapter 8. Now, here's why I tell you all this. What I see here in chapter 9 is that Daniel, he wants to understand. I think these are reoccurring dreams because he's mourning all the time. He's seeking God. He's trying to figure this out. So he's diligently searching the scriptures and he's asking for wisdom as he tries to get his mind around all these things. And so he's reading the scroll of the prophet Jeremiah, and he reads where Jeremiah says the Babylonian exile will last 70 years. Now, where did he find that? Well, it's in what we call chapter 25, and here it is. Therefore, the Lord says this to Israel, because you have not listened to my words, you haven't kept terms of the covenant, I will summon all the peoples of the north and my servant Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, and I will bring them against this land and its inhabitants and against all the surrounding nations, and I will completely destroy them, making them an everlasting ruin. This whole country will become a desolate wasteland, and these nations will serve the king of Babylon for 70 years. Now, that prophecy came 50 years before the actual events. Pretty cool. Now, Daniel, he's now in his 80s. He's been in exile for over 60 years, and he is reading Jeremiah, and he does the math, and he figures out, wow, the 70 years is almost up, and now he's filled with hope. And that motivates him to pray, verse 4, and I prayed to the Lord my God, and I, what? He says, I made confession. Like I prayed to my God, and I confessed. I mean, now to me that's strange. I mean, I can imagine Daniel saying, 70 years, finally, God. I mean, come on. Like it's about time. I could imagine him being kind of upset that he's had to put up with this all these years. Now, I'm really strange, and now I'd like to know how many of you are strange like me, but you ever go through something really hard, and you make it through, and then and it all actually works out, but instead of rejoicing, you're mad that you had to go through it? Anybody? Like, I'm like that. I'm sorry. I'm just that's the way I'm trying to get better. I'm getting better. God's maturing me. He's growing me up in the faith, so I'm getting better at it, but I confess I'm like that. I mean, I end up having a little pity party that I had to go through it. You know, and I gripe and I complain. Daniel doesn't do that. He doesn't have a pity party. He does something that's really strange. He confesses, and what we're about to see is that to Daniel, confessing is admitting to God the wrongdoing and the sin that I've participated in. And we hear that and we're going, wait a minute, what did Daniel do? I mean, he's like one of the faithful few here. But somehow Daniel didn't process it like that. He doesn't feel that way. Now, this is one of the most beautiful prayers of confession in all the Bible, so I'm going to read it all the way through, and then we'll reflect on a couple of things in the prayer. Verse 4. I prayed to the Lord my God, and I made confession, saying, O Lord, the great and awesome God, who keeps covenant and steadfast love with those who love him and keep his commandments, we have sinned and done wrong. We have acted wickedly and rebelled. We have turned aside from your commandments and rules. We have not listened to your servants, the prophets, who spoke in your name to our kings and princes and fathers and to all the people of the land. You, O Lord, are righteous, but to us belongs open shame. to us, the men of Judah, the inhabitants of Jerusalem, and all Israel, to those who are near and those who are far away in all the lands to which you've driven them, because of their unfaithful deeds they have committed against you. Yes, to us, O Lord, belongs open shame, to our kings, princes, fathers, because we've sinned against you. But to the Lord our God belong mercy and forgiveness, but we've rebelled against him. In spite of that, we have not obeyed the voice of the Lord God. We haven't obeyed the laws he gave us through his servants, the prophets. All Israel has transgressed your law and turned aside, refusing to obey your voice. Therefore, the curses and oath that are written in the law of Moses, the servant of God, have been poured out upon us because we have sinned against him. He has confirmed his words, which he spoke against us and against our rulers who ruled us by bringing this great disaster upon us. For under the whole heaven there's not been anything like what has been done to Jerusalem. As it is written in the law of Moses, all this disaster has come upon us, yet we have not entreated the favor of the Lord our God by turning from our iniquities and gaining insight by your truth. Therefore the Lord has brought disaster upon us, for the Lord our God is righteous in all his works, and yet we've not obeyed his voice. So now, O Lord our God, who brought your people out of the land of Egypt with a mighty hand and have made a name for yourself as it is this day, hear us. We have sinned. We have done wrong. O Lord, according to all your righteous acts, let your anger and your wrath turn away from your city, Jerusalem, your holy hill, because of our sins, for the iniquities of our fathers. Jerusalem and your people have become a byword among all who are around us. Now, therefore, O Lord our God, listen to the prayer of your servant and his pleas for mercy. And for your own sake, O Lord, make your face shine upon your sanctuary, which is desolate. Oh, my God, incline your ear and hear. Open your eyes and see our desolations and the city that's called by your name. For we do not present our pleas before you because we are righteous, but because of your great mercy. O Lord, hear. Lord, forgive. Lord, pay attention and act. Don't delay. For your own sake, oh my God, because your city and your people are called by your name, act. I tell you, there's so much going on in here in this about the spiritual practice of confession, but I'm just going to focus on one big idea that kind of has two parts to it, but one big idea, and that is this. The heartbeat of Daniel's prayer focuses on God's character. And God's character shapes Daniel's prayer and his character. The heartbeat of Daniel's prayer is focused on God's character, and God's character shapes his prayer and his character. And there's one main attribute that he emphasizes about God's character, and he repeats it over and over again. Did you catch it? What's the one character quality of God that he repeats over and over again? Righteousness. Righteous. God is righteous in all he does. Look at it, verse 7. Lord, you are righteous, but we are covered with shame. And because of that, verse 14, the Lord brought disaster upon us because the Lord our God is righteous. And then down in verses 16 through 19, he says, Lord, in keeping with your righteous actions, turn away your anger and your wrath, not because we are righteous, but because of your mercy. Lord, listen. Lord, please forgive. Now hear me, this is so very important because what Daniel understands about God's character is what shapes his praying, and it's what shapes him as a man. It shapes his character. His understanding of God's righteousness makes him humble instead of being proud. His view of God's righteousness prevents Daniel from taking on a martyr mentality and throwing himself a pity party. Instead, his view of God's righteousness humbles him. Now look at this. According to Daniel, who has sinned? Who has sinned? We have sinned. And he says it over and over again. We have sinned. We have rebelled. We have disobeyed. We have acted wickedly. To my count, he says that about 11 times. And in all of this, his view of his sin comes because of how he sees God's perfect standard of righteousness. The Hebrew word is the word tzedek. Tzedek. It's T-S-E-D-E-Q. Tzedek. And it means righteous. Righteous is one of those words we don't use every day, right? I mean, like when was the last time that you described somebody as being righteous? You know, last week, did you describe anybody you worked with as a righteous person? Or do you call your neighbor, oh, I've got my neighbor, yeah, she's righteous, I'm telling you. I mean, I've never heard that except maybe in an old Wesley Snipes movie. They used to use that back in the 70s or whatever. Or you might use the word if you're still fans of these guys. You know, the righteous brothers, like I guess they considered themselves righteous, and, you know, because they named themselves that. I just noticed I had my hands on both sides. Anyway, all right, forget that. I was looking for a way to work humor into the message today, But you know, you've lost that love and feeling, right? Whoa. Okay. Anyway, what does righteous even mean? What does it even mean? What would you say? Like if you're teaching kids, fellowship kids, and they say, well, I don't, you know, what's righteous? What does it mean? What would you say? I think most of us would probably say, well, be a righteous person is a morally good person, something like that. That's not it. It's much more than that, especially when you're going to attribute it to God and call God righteous. The Hebrew word, tzedek, is actually a relationship word. Tim Mackey and the Bible Project guys, and by the way, I got a lot of help on this message from Tim, but the Bible Project guys define it this way. Righteous is a word that describes someone's character, not in and of themselves, but the character you see demonstrated in how they treat people in their relationships. That's what it means to be. It's a relationship word. You can be a good person by yourself, but you can't be a righteous person by yourself. Because the only way you know if a person is righteous is by how they treat people. One of my professors, Old Testament Hebrew scholar Bruce Waltke, describes a righteous person, in other words, someone who is practicing tzedek, as a person who lives in right relationship with God and others. Right? Righteous is a relationship word. Now, so think about that. It's a relationship. Let's think of some relationships. If you're a husband and a father, how would you demonstrate being a righteous husband and father? Well, you would display righteousness towards your wife and kids by being faithful and loving and being committed to their good, being present, being involved. These are all the kinds of behaviors that are right for that kind of relationship. But let's say that same person is a business owner and he has a whole bunch of people working for him. So how is he a righteous employee? Well, not by snuggling up to his employees, and tucking them in at bedtime, even though that might be righteous behavior for the dad. But no, a righteous employer would be someone who treats his employees with respect. He's a person of integrity, someone who pays a fair wage, who creates a great work environment, that kind of thing. So you see what I'm getting at? The behavior changes depending on what kind of relationship it is, but the overall trait that's common to all of these relationships is that a righteous person does right by people. A righteous person does right by people. You ever use that term like, oh, you need to do right by that person? That's what, we don't use it that much, but that's what he's talking about. So in Daniel 9:7, he says, Lord, you have displayed righteousness to us, and that causes us to feel ashamed. In other words, God, you have done right by us. You brought us up out of the land of Egypt. You brought us into the promised land, even though we didn't deserve it. You sent prophets to try to call us back. You've done right by us, but we haven't done right by you for centuries. You have been faithful to us, but we've been unfaithful to you. For centuries, you have kept covenant with us, but we didn't keep covenant with you. You have done right by us. We have not done right by you. Then he goes on to say in verse 14, Lord, you have brought disaster upon us because you are righteous. So think about this now. Daniel says that God has done right by Israel by bringing disaster on them for their centuries-long covenant-breaking sin. What about that? Well, this isn't dad righteousness or employer righteousness. This is judge righteousness. Like if someone breaks into your home and they cause all kind of damage and they steal a bunch of your stuff, and you report it to the police, and about a week after that, they catch the guy that broke in, and that person is hauled before the judge. And you come to court, and there's the person that's guilty. He's broken into your home, and there's the judge, and the judge has looked at the evidence, and he's ready to pass judgment on this crime that has been committed. And if you're sitting there, and if the judge were to say to you, or say to the man who committed the crime, well, I'm sure you're probably having a really bad day. And, all of us have bad days. And so we're just going to let this one go, but I don't want to see you in my courtroom again. Now, would that be righteous? Has that judge done right by you? Has that judge done right by the community by letting this guy go out and maybe he does it all over again? Has the judge done right by the law? No, it's not righteous. In this case, righteousness calls for the judge to bring serious consequences to bear on the evil of the destructive behavior, and that is right. And to do so, to pass judgment and issue a penalty, the judge is doing right by you, the victim, doing right by the community, and doing right by the law. And that's why Daniel says Jerusalem was destroyed, because God is righteous. It would not be good. It would not be righteous if God just let Israel continue in their sin. So that's why he says in verse 14, the Lord brought disaster on us because the Lord is righteous. Follow me? It was right that God brought justice to bear on their sin, and that he held them accountable for their sin. That's God's righteous justice. But that's not all. There is to God's righteousness. Look back at verses 16 through 19 again. Lord, he says, Lord, in keeping with your righteous actions, turn away your anger and your wrath. Not because we are righteous, but because of your mercy. Okay, so he says, Lord, you were righteous to bring justice. And now I'm asking you that you would be righteous and bring mercy and forgiveness. You see that? So God's righteousness compels him to bring justice, and God's righteousness also compels him to forgive and to restore. So God is righteous in his justice, and he is righteous in his mercy. He does right in bringing justice to bear on sin, and he does right in forgiving sin. And it's just like parenting. Now I need to push rewind, go back to when I was about 37. All right, so if I watch my kids hit each other and be ugly to each other, and there are no consequences, am I a righteous dad? No, I am not doing right by them, because they're going to grow up thinking that this is a perfectly good, fine way to treat other people. So I have to create a safe environment where they experience consequences for their hurtful behavior, and that is righteous. That is naming and exposing wrong and holding them and making them accountable for it. But that's not my only job as a dad, right? I mean, yeah, I need to help them see that bad behavior breaks relationships, and it does have serious consequences, but then I also need to help them see that there's a way forward to heal the relationship. And this is about teaching them to apologize and to admit where they've done wrong, to ask for forgiveness, and then to grant forgiveness. So as a dad, can I say that I'm doing right by my children if I don't ever show them how relationships can be restored? No. So now, look, this is the story of the Bible. God created us, and he gave us all good things, but we turned our back on God, and basically humanity has run God's good world into the ground. And because God is righteous in his justice, there have been and are and there will be serious consequences to our sin and wrongdoing. But his ultimate purpose is to bring blessing to his enemies. So because God is righteous in his mercy, he makes a way to forgive and restore us. In fact, he's made a promise that he will heal and restore this world. That is the promise of the Bible, that one day God will make this world new, and his people will live in a right relationship with God and with each other forever. So Daniel sees God as righteous by letting us sit in the mess we make for ourselves, but God isn't fully righteous until he does something to deal with and restore and to heal and to bless. God is righteous in his justice and his mercy because he promised both. And justice and mercy are not in contradiction to each other. They actually work perfectly together. Now, here's the point. It's Daniel's rich view of God's righteousness that shapes his character. It's his rich view of God's character, his righteousness, his righteous in justice, righteous in mercy, that humbles him. He could be tempted to throw a pity party because he's one of God's faithful few. But that's not what he does, because he sees that God is righteous in all that he does, in his justice and his mercy, and it humbles him. And here's the deal. He sees then that he is a participant in the huge mess that he's a part of. And he may have contributed to it in a way that's different from the corrupt kings and the corrupt priests of Israel, or the people who sacrificed their children to Moloch and foreign gods. But when he kneels before God's perfect righteousness, he sees and he owns and he confesses his own guilt. Are you seeing this? This is so profound. This is how you know if someone really understands God's righteousness, because they're humble. They don't view themselves as better than other people. They don't point the finger and accuse and blame, because they always see themselves as a part of the problem, because they know how far they too fall short of God's perfect righteousness. That's why the Apostle Paul, floored by the righteousness of God, says, I'm the chief of sinners. I'm worst of all. That's not false humility. He really believes that, because if you measure yourself against the perfect standard of the righteousness of God, you see how far you fall short. And that should lead us to confession. Now, that's Daniel's strange prayer. But what's even more strange is that the answer to his prayer comes in the form of prophecy. All right, verse 20. While I was speaking and praying, confessing my sin and the sin of my people, Israel, and presenting my pleas before the Lord my God for the holy hill of my God, while I was speaking in prayer, the man Gabriel, whom I had seen in a vision at first, meaning chapter 8, came to me in swift flight at the time of the evening sacrifice. That was one of the times that Daniel prayed. Remember, he prayed 3 times a day. He made me understand, speaking to me, saying, Daniel, I've come to give you insight and understanding. At the very beginning of your pleas for mercy, a word went out, and I've come to tell you, for you are greatly loved. Therefore, consider the word and understand this vision. In other words, consider what I'm about to tell you. All right, you ready for this? Whew. Verse 24. 70 weeks are decreed about your people and your holy city. Who is this talking about? Is it talking about the church? No, it's talking about the Jews. 70 weeks are decreed about your people and your holy city. To finish, now these are very important. To finish transgression, to put an end to sin, to atone for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal both vision and prophecy, and to anoint a most holy place. All clear? Seems simple and straightforward, right? Nah, no. Go back. What's Daniel doing? He's sitting and he's reading Jeremiah, and he's hoping that the exile is going to be over shortly. And because Jeremiah said it would last how long? 70 years, so time's almost up. So he prays this prayer, and he starts confessing, Lord, we've sinned against you. We were wrong. You were right to send us into exile, just like you said you would in Leviticus and Deuteronomy in the law of Moses. And he humbles himself through confession. We've sinned. We've acted wickedly. We've done wrong. Please forgive us. But now heal us. The 70 years is almost up. And Daniel, this is the key. Daniel hopes that this exile and this painful experience has dealt with Israel's sin and rebellion against Yahweh once and for all. Because if you keep reading in Jeremiah, you come to what we call chapter 31, where we read about God bringing the people back to the land, and God institutes a new covenant with Israel where God says, I'll put my law in them, and I'll write it on their hearts, and I'll be their God, and they'll be my people, and I'll forgive their iniquity and their sin. I will remember no more. So Daniel is very hopeful that Israel will return to their land and to the glory days of the David and Solomon's kingdom, and Israel will sin no more, and Daniel thinks the 70 years in exile will do it. But that's not what he hears from Gabriel. Gabriel basically says that at the end of the 70 years, your people are going to return. They can go back home, but to accomplish all that God has planned for Israel, it will take 70 weeks. Literally 70 sevens. Same word in the Hebrew. 70 sevens. Gabriel is saying, you thought it was going to be 70 years, but it's actually 70 times 7, which is 490 years. Bummer. I mean, if you're Daniel, how do you feel about now? I mean, not good. Yeah, in 70 years, a group of exiles will go back to Jerusalem, and under Ezra and Nehemiah, they're going to eventually rebuild the city and the walls and the streets and the temple. But this 70-year exile, follows verse 24, has not fully dealt with Israel's transgression, has not brought an end to sin. It did not fully atone for Israel's iniquity. It will not usher in an age of eternal righteousness, a kingdom where people live in right relationship with God and each other forever. Story's not over. Apparently, Israel's brokenness and sin run so deep that this exile to Babylon is just the first chapter of a much longer story of God's judgment. And if you're Daniel, this is not good news. So here's where it goes from here, verse 25. Know therefore and understand that, now this is important, mark these little signposts, from the going out of the word to restore and rebuild Jerusalem, from the decree that says go back and build Jerusalem, until the coming of the anointed one, anointed, Greek is Christ, NAS, love the translation, until the coming of Messiah the Prince, there shall be 7 sevens. How many years is that? 49. And 62 sevens. How many is that? That's harder, isn't it? 483. So when you add 49 and 434, you get 483, 69 weeks. And it, Jerusalem, will be built again with streets and a moat, but in times of trouble. Then, after 62 sevens, the anointed one will be cut off. He will be put to death. And he will have nothing. It'll look like his life didn't amount to anything. Everybody deserted him. And then, fast forward, the people of the ruler will come and destroy the city and the sanctuary, and its end will come with a flood. That's 70 A.D., Jerusalem destroyed. And to the end, there will be wars and rumors of wars. Desolations are decreed. And he, fast forward, the ruler of the bad guys, will make a strong covenant with many for 1 7. How many is 1 7? 7 years. But in the middle of the 7, that's 3.5 years, he will put an end to sacrifice and offering, and he'll set up an abomination of desolation until the decreed end is poured out on the one who makes desolate. All clear? Okay, let's pray and go home. Now, I know for some of you, you've been waiting for me to get here so I can unpack all of this and name the Antichrist before we leave this morning. And maybe unpack 666, which is not in Daniel. But anyway, now, to your disappointment, I'm not going to do that. I'm sorry. You can email me at jthompson@fellowshipgreenville.org. But this is a very complex biblical passage. I mean, nearly every word and line and phrase is debated. But there are 3 main views of this passage, but within each of the 3 views, there are permutations about numbers. Are they literal or symbolic, as well as starting points and ending dates and all kinds of things. But here's a quick overview of the 3 views. The first view is that there are those who think that everything that was written here was accomplished when Antiochus Epiphanes marched into Jerusalem 150 years before Jesus. He marched into Jerusalem during the time of the Maccabees, and he killed the high priest, desecrated the altar in the temple by offering a pig on the altar, and main point is, some people think it was all fulfilled about 300 years after Daniel, 150 years before Jesus, by Antiochus Epiphanes. Now, others think that this prophecy extends through the time of Antiochus Epiphanes and extends all the way up to Jesus, and they say that everything in verse 24 was completely fulfilled in Jesus' first coming when he died on the cross. And there are others who think that the prophecy runs through Antiochus Epiphanes up through the beginning of Jesus' public ministry, and then on the cross, Jesus fulfilled what was written there in verse 24, but not completely. People in group 3 believe that in his first coming, Jesus inaugurated the kingdom and instituted the new covenant, but the complete and final fulfillment will come at his second coming after a period of great tribulation, which is how I understand the passage as someone who ascribes to a premillennial understanding of prophecy. Now, Chelsea helped me put together a chart I'm going to put up on the screen, and I'm not going to really go through this in great detail. You can download it. It's available on the app and on the website, but one thing I want to draw your attention to. Notice that on the left-hand side, Daniel's 69 weeks, okay? 483 years. And then 49 years to rebuild Jerusalem. Then after that, there's 434 years that lead up to the coming of Messiah the Prince. Now, if you take the date of the decree to go and rebuild Jerusalem as 457 BC, and you add 483 years, you come to 27 AD, which is the date of the beginning of Jesus' ministry. Lots of people agree with this. He was baptized, and then he goes out and begins his ministry. And I got chills when I saw this week. He says, the time is fulfilled. What time? The time that's been unfolded to Daniel. I mean, it's just so good. And some people will take that Daniel 70th week and cram it right up next to the 69. But as I understand it, the Messiah is cut off after the 62 weeks. Rome comes in, destroys Jerusalem, and there's a prophetic gap, the time of the Gentiles, the church age. There's nothing in Daniel about the church. It's all about Israel. And so there is this gap before the 70th week starts. So there's that. You can dig into it in a little more detail. That's my view. I could be wrong about my view, but I don't think I am, so there you go. But there are lots of committed, Bible-believing, Jesus-loving people who hold different views. Now, here's what everybody agrees on. Did the 70 years deal fully with Israel's sin and transgression? Everybody agrees. No, it did not. There's a longer period of time that's going to come, and near the end of that time, the anointed one will come. Greek word for anointed, Christ. Messiah, the Prince, will come, and he will be cut off. And so all of this is a part of a much longer story of how God is going to, verse 24, finish transgression, put an end to sin, atone for iniquity, seal up prophecy, and usher in a time of eternal righteousness. His righteousness and mercy are going to come together at a point for the redemption of Israel. You follow me? So Gabriel tells Daniel that there's something yet to be done beyond the 70 years of exile, where God's righteous justice and God's righteous mercy converge to punish sin and to forgive sin. Now tell me, what greater something could you be looking for than the moment of the cross? The cross is precisely the moment when the true evil nature of our sin is exposed, because it cost the death of God's Son. And when on the cross, when God's righteous justice was satisfied and his righteous mercy was poured out, we have both justice and mercy meeting. And if you really grasp what happens on the cross in that moment in history, it's not some distant thing that happened 2,000 years ago. It's an event that exposes all of us today, because the truth is, we were all participants in putting Jesus on that cross. We were all participants in putting Jesus on that cross. I wasn't there. I didn't physically hold the hammer that they nailed him there with. But we are responsible, because my sin and your sin put him there every bit as much as those who actually nailed him there. Now, just like you and I are participants and contributors to nailing Jesus to the cross, we are also participants and contributors to the ongoing sin in our world today. You see, if you understand the perfect righteousness of God, his perfect righteous standard, it'll humble you, because you'll realize that we are all participants in the sins that dominate the landscape of our nation today. We're all participants. You'll confess that we're all contributors to what's gone wrong in our country. I mean, isn't that true? I mean, have we really been salt and light? Have people been able to look at God's church and go, look at the light, man, they see our good works and they're drawn? Now, most of the time, we're throwing hand grenades at people. I mean, and has the church preserved its identity, or have we assimilated into the civil religion of consumerism and greed and privilege and politics? I mean, when 80% of people in churches today give less than 2% of their income to churches to help further the mission of Jesus in the world and help care for those in need, are we really handling our money any different than people who don't know God? When the divorce rate in the church is no different than the divorce rate in the culture? When the sexual standards of people in the church is no different than people in the culture? Can we really think of ourselves as God's faithful few? And what about it, baby boomers? People of my generation. Did we put the love of Jesus on display during the years of the moral majority? No, we didn't. We believed that we were morally superior to everybody else. We believed that we were in the right as God's faithful few. And we felt justified in our angry, mean-spirited attitudes and actions toward anyone who didn't believe or live like us. I mean, isn't that right? We're participants. We're contributors to the sin. If we measure ourselves by God's perfect standard of righteousness, we all fall short. I mean, think, since the last time we were together, we all have ways that we've failed, right? We all have ways that we've sinned. We all have ways that we've compromised. We've all been inconsistent as followers of Jesus, and in all of those ways, we are contributors to the problems in our world. Do we ever confess any of that? Some Christians don't even believe in confession anymore. You know, over the course of this whole two-part exile series that started with 1 Peter way back in January, I've had a dozen or so people come up, and they ask me the same question. They say, Charlie, I hear what you're saying about exile and where we are today, but what about prayer? I mean, shouldn't we be praying for revival? Shouldn't we be praying for God to intervene and turn things around? Well, of course we should be praying. But you know what? Too often, our prayers are focused on asking God to fix what's out there rather than to fix what's in here or in here. I mean, what if God is allowing us to be exiles in our own land in order to purify his people so that we regain our identity as the people of God? What if he cares more about purifying the church than saving our nation? Would you be okay with that? If that was the answer to your prayer, would you be okay with that? You better be. If we truly grasped the perfect righteousness of God, then our prayers and our character would reflect a Daniel-like humility, because Daniel points us to the greater Daniel, Jesus, who's the most humble of all.